Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Our first story is about H. Holmes, the murder castle. Chicago wore a gray, uneasy look in the early 1890s. The city was growing too fast, its streets overflowing with new faces, new fortunes, and new dangers that stitched themselves into the alleys and tenements. Steam curled from the elevated trains. Coal smoke drifted across the skyline. Behind the noise and dust of expansion, it was easy for someone cruel to disappear in the crowd. And that's exactly what Herman Webster Mudgett did when he transformed himself into H. Holmes, a name that sounded respectable, steady, trustworthy. A name that opened doors. Holmes stepped into Chicago like a man stepping onto a personal stage. Each gesture calculated, each smile rehearsed, each lie delivered with the confidence of someone who knew he would not be questioned. He didn't just blend into the city. He used its chaos as camouflage. Holmes arrived in Englewood with a plan already taking shape. He worked at a local pharmacy, charming customers with courteous manners. He was polite, almost gentle. People liked him instantly. But behind that composure lived something colder, something predatory. He watched people, learned their habits, memorized their hopes and fears. He could see weak points like a craftsman studying wood grain. Soon, he bought the empty lot across from the pharmacy. On that patch of dirt and debris, he envisioned a building that would serve him in ways no one could understand at first glance. He told neighbors it would be a mixed-use structure. Shops on the ground floor, rooms to rent above. Something respectable, something good for the neighborhood. People nodded, pleased the young businessman was investing in their community. Construction began in 1887. Holmes controlled every stage of it obsessively. He fired workers constantly, often refusing to pay them. Each crew only saw fragments of the building before being dismissed, so no one fully understood what they were constructing. Rooms that led nowhere, doors that locked only from the outside. Soundproofing in unexpected places. A peculiar chute built into the interior wall. Some workers questioned him. They didn't question for long. Holmes kept a friendly face as he walked among the half-finished hallways, offering compliments, cracking jokes, pretending nothing was strange. But he supervised with absolute vigilance. He knew what each secret corridor would be for. By the time the world's Columbian Exposition brought thousands into Chicago, Holmes's structure loomed finished. An odd, sprawling building the neighbors jokingly called the castle. They couldn't know how appropriate that word was. The front of the building appeared ordinary, with a drugstore, a jewelry shop, and other storefronts. Behind those harmless walls stretched a maze of rooms and passages designed with purpose. Holmes had engineered something unique. A building built for control, for confinement, for disappearance. Guests checked into his second-floor rooms frequently. Young women came to the city seeking jobs. Visitors attending the fair looked for affordable lodging. Holmes made sure he met them personally. His charisma never wavered. He spoke softly, offered help, made them feel safe. Some tenants stayed only a night. Some stayed longer. Some are never seen again. Holmes targeted women most often, especially those without family nearby. He hired them as stenographers or assistants, encouraging them to sign life insurance policies with him as the beneficiary. He had a way of making these suggestions sound practical, almost protective. Many trusted him completely. Once inside the castle, Holmes controlled their world. Some rooms were fitted with gas lines he could manipulate from a hidden closet. Some were airtight, sealed by steel plates he'd commissioned from an ironworks factory under false names. Others contained peepholes that allowed him to watch without being seen. A few rooms had walls lined not with wallpaper, but with asbestos, allowing flames to burn hotter and longer. Holmes moved through the castle like a conductor guiding a grim symphony. He kept meticulous notes on his tenants, their habits, their fears, their finances. He isolated them slowly. He spoke softly, always softly. When he chose to act, it was precise, calculated. For some victims, he used the gas lines, turning valves in secret chambers. For others, he He preferred methods that required proximity, where he could watch the fear in their eyes. Several were forced down the chute, the alley, he sometimes called it, which slid their bodies into the basement. The basement was the true heart of the castle. It was packed with instruments he called his artistic tools. A cremation furnace, vats of corrosive chemicals, surgical tables, racks for bones. When he needed money, he sold some skeletons to medical schools, claiming they came from legitimate sources. Outwardly, Holmes remained a model citizen. He attended social events. He flirted. He joked about business struggles. He invested in new scams, elaborate cons involving fake inventions, sham companies, bogus insurance claims. He always smiled. Always. His crimes might have continued for years, if not for a different scheme entirely. Holmes entered a partnership with a man named Benjamin Pittizel, a carpenter and occasional con artist. Together they planned a large insurance fraud. Pittizel would fake his death, and Holmes would collect the payout. The plan required Pittizel to vanish temporarily. Holmes assured him everything would go smoothly. It did not go smoothly. Instead of finding a corpse that resembled Pittizel, Holmes simply used Pittizel himself. He staged the scene. He told authorities Pittizel had died in an accidental explosion. He collected the insurance money. Then he sought out Pittizel's wife with terrible ease, promising to help her, to guide her, to handle all the arrangements on her behalf. She believed him. Most people did. Holmes then took custody of 3 of the Pittizel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, under the guise of reuniting them with their father. The children trusted him too. He had a gift for trust. Holmes moved constantly then, traveling by train across several states. Those who later testified said he behaved oddly during this period, restless, impatient, frequently glancing over his shoulder. He stayed in cheap hotels. He rented houses under false names. He kept the children separated, telling each group comforting lies about the others. Eventually, those lies grew thin. Investigators looking into the insurance fraud noticed inconsistencies. Holmes's history of unpaid debts and abandoned construction projects drew suspicion. Detectives traced his movements, noting the missing children. Holmes tried to stay ahead of them, shifting locations almost daily, but the net closed faster than he expected. He was arrested in Boston in 1894. At first, he denied everything. He spoke with the same soft charm he'd used for years. But detectives were persistent. They traced his steps backward. They found rented houses where trunks were discovered containing terrible evidence. They uncovered shallow graves. They exhumed bodies. They learned the fate of the Pittizel children. Holmes remained composed through it all. Only occasionally did the mask slip, revealing glimpses of irritation or boredom. He seemed less troubled by the accusations than by the inconvenience of being confined. As newspapers learned the details, the public fascination grew uncontrollable. Reporters described the castle in breathless, horrified tones. Its secret rooms, its vanished tenants, its furnace, its iron-lined walls. Crowds gathered outside the building, pointing at windows and whispering about what might have happened inside. Holmes continued to speak with confidence, spinning new versions of events almost daily. At times he admitted to murders, then retracted the confessions hours later. He altered details constantly. He seemed to enjoy watching reporters struggle to follow his stories. The trial focused primarily on the murder of Benjamin Pittizel. It was a straightforward case, supported by evidence Holmes couldn't bend with charm or deception. He was convicted quickly. Only after the verdict did he offer a final confession, or what he called confession. In it, he claimed to have killed 27 people. Investigators doubted the accuracy of this number. Some names belonged to people who were still alive. Others had been missing for years with no connection to Holmes at all. His statements contradicted earlier claims. Some details were impossible, but some details rang true. Holmes said he was born with the devil within, a phrase repeated by newspapers for months afterward. He described himself as a creature shaped for deception, someone who felt no pull of conscience. Whether those words were genuine or simply another performance was never proven. Holmes controlled the story until the very end, bending truth and fiction until no one could separate them. He was executed in 1896. Witnesses said he remained calm as the hood was placed over his head. His posture never changed. His breathing never trembled. Even in his last moments, he behaved as if everyone else was acting out a scene he had written long ago. The castle stood empty for years afterward. People avoided it instinctively. Children dared each other to run up and touch the front door. Adults crossed the street to walk on the opposite side. Eventually, a fire destroyed much of the building. Some said it was arson. Some said it was an accident. The truth was never confirmed. But long before those flames burned away the walls, the structure had already left its mark. A maze built by a man who understood fear intimately and used architecture as his accomplice. And in Chicago's history, the memory of that place remains threaded like a dark seam under the city's bright surface, impossible to remove, impossible to forget. Next story is the Cleveland Torso Murders. Cleveland, Ohio. The city in the 1930s wore the exhaustion of the Great Depression like a second skin. Factories clanged along the riverfront, their smoke thick and choking. Streets were crowded with men and women searching for work, for food, for hope. Streetcars rattled across steel tracks. Gas lamps flickered in alleys that smelled of coal, sweat, and decay. It was into this city, one of hardship and shadow, that a predator arrived. One who would earn a name that still chills the spine. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The first victims appeared quietly, discovered by neighbors or city workers. They were usually poor, drifters, sometimes prostitutes, always people whom society could afford to lose. In Kingsbury Run, a rough patch of woodlands and scrub on the city's east side, bodies were found scattered like discarded dolls. Limbs severed, torsos missing, heads gone. The killings were grotesque, surgical in some ways, careless in others. Detectives were baffled. The police force at the time was overworked, stretched thin by the city's economic pressures. Patrols were minimal in the poorer districts. Coroners were busy with industrial accidents and the daily toll of poverty. Each discovery of a body sparked fear, outrage, and yet frustration. No one could connect the pieces. The Mad Butcher moved with precision and invisibility. Victims were dismembered with a kind of efficiency that suggested knowledge of anatomy. Some were decapitated cleanly. Others were hacked, thrown carelessly into the underbrush. Clothes were often removed. Sometimes belongings were missing. Other times, bodies were positioned unnaturally, arranged almost deliberately. A pattern slowly emerged. The victims were almost exclusively local women. Most had tenuous connections to the city, jobs in bars or factories, transit lives. Their absence often went unreported for days. By the time detectives discovered a corpse, decomposition had set in. Identification was difficult, slow, imperfect. Public fear intensified with each new discovery. Kingsbury Run became a place of dread. Children were warned not to stray too far from home. Women traveled in groups at night. Neighbors peered out windows, listening for the rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a street cat. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered of ritual, of madness, of revenge. Others simply said the city itself had grown too harsh, too hungry, too cruel, and that some men were capable of anything. The first major case officially linked to the killer involved a young woman named Anna Lloyd. Her torso was found near the river, partially submerged. Limbs were missing. The head had been removed. The coroner noted careful slicing at the joints. Someone knew where to cut. The sight of her dismembered body horrified the neighborhood, but also sparked a renewed effort from police. Detective Elliot Ness, already gaining notoriety for his Prohibition-era work against gangsters, was assigned to the case. Ness, methodical and dogged, approached the killings like a puzzle, a grim labyrinth he could not allow himself to ignore. He coordinated search parties in Kingsbury Run, interviewed vagrants, questioned barmaids and bartenders, traced the comings and goings of residents. Each lead seemed to vanish into thin air. The killer escalated. More victims appeared, sometimes in public spaces, sometimes hidden behind abandoned buildings or railroad tracks. The level of dismemberment varied. Sometimes the body was neatly chopped, sometimes limbs were thrown randomly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events from horrific fragments. Police theorized that the killer might be local, familiar with the city's geography, capable of navigating alleys and industrial areas without drawing attention. By the late 1930s, Cleveland had a media frenzy. Newspapers ran headlines in bold type. Mad Butcher terrorizes Cleveland. Bodies found in Kingsbury Run. Is Cleveland safe? Readers devoured each story. Horror and morbid fascination entwined. Editorials called for curfews. Civic leaders demanded action. The fear was palpable. The killer thrived in the anxiety he inspired. Victims were often anonymous. Many were identified only through clothing or personal effects, sometimes only months after discovery. Others remained nameless. The anonymity heightened the terror. Anyone could vanish without a trace. Families were uncertain. Friends whispered about missing neighbors. Strangers feared crossing paths with the unseen predator. Attempts to apprehend the Mad Butcher were frustrated by multiple factors. The killer was clever, patient, and mobile. Some believed he had medical or surgical knowledge. Others thought he was a vagrant, familiar with the outskirts of the city, able to disappear into the shadows. Ness considered every possibility, from organized criminal activity to a single lunatic with anatomical skill. One of the most chilling aspects was the randomness. Victims were not robbed. Their deaths had no clear motive. There was no discernible pattern of grudges or revenge. Some theorized a ritualistic aspect, but no evidence confirmed it. The horror lay in unpredictability. The city could never feel safe. A woman walking home from work, a man returning to a boarding house. Anyone could be next. The killings peaked in 1938. A new discovery shocked even veteran officers. Frances Brown, a factory worker, found partially decomposed near a derelict building. Her torso was removed. Closer inspection revealed crude but deliberate incisions at major joints. The brutality suggested frustration and rage, but the precision suggested knowledge. Some limbs were missing entirely, possibly disposed of elsewhere. Investigators searched for leads across the city, but came up empty-handed. The public demanded action. Citizens organized patrols. Church groups held vigils. Families stopped letting children roam freely. Still, the killer struck again. The fear was compounded by helplessness. People knew that law enforcement was trying, that detectives like Ness were relentless, but no one had an answer. Eventually, police identified a suspect, a man named Richard Cottingham, a local with a history of violence and mental instability. He was detained, questioned extensively, and released. Evidence was circumstantial at best. Cottingham's name faded from official reports, but revealed just how elusive the true killer was. Detectives turned to forensic evidence, what little they had. Fingerprints were few. Blood analysis was primitive. Photography captured fragments of the crime scenes. Sketches were made. Even so, each body discovered in Kingsbury Run remained a challenge, a testament to the killer's cunning. Speculation flourished. Was the Mad Butcher a man driven by sexual compulsion? A psychotic who found joy in terror? Or someone methodical who studied anatomy and death as a craft? The truth was never fully known. Ness never identified a final suspect. Some bodies were never linked to a killer at all. The Mad Butcher left behind a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. By 1939, the killings slowed. Whether the killer moved away, died, or simply stopped is unclear. The city exhaled slowly but never entirely. Residents still whispered about Kingsbury Run. Mothers warned daughters. Men hesitated before walking alone at night. The fear never fully dissipated. Cleveland had been marked, forever altered by an unseen hand. Even decades later, the legend of the Cleveland torso murders persisted. Historians, true crime writers, and urban explorers returned to Kingsbury Run, sifting through reports, maps, and archives. They pieced together fragments of victims' lives, their final moments, and the methods of a killer who combined patience, brutality, and knowledge. The Mad Butcher remains unidentified. The city moves on. Streets are paved over. Buildings rise where brush and scrub once hid horror. Yet Kingsbury Run and its dark history are not forgotten. Its shadows linger in the corners of memory, in the way people talk about places they do not go, in the uneasy silence after a late-night stroll. Cleveland endured. Life persisted. But somewhere in those abandoned spaces, fragments of the past remain. A torso here, a limb there, reminders of a killer who vanished as silently as he arrived. Next up is the Axeman of New Orleans. New Orleans in the 1910s was a city that breathed in rhythms. Streetcars rattling along St. Charles, jazz drifting from smoky bars, voices rising and falling in the humid night air. Candlelight glowed behind shutters, and narrow alleyways stayed damp even on warm evenings. The city felt alive, almost watchful. But in 1918, something else began to move through those streets. Not the music, not the crowds, not the restless tide of the Mississippi. Something quieter, something violent. The first attack took place in May in a small grocery store owned by Joseph and Catherine Maggio. Their shop sat on the corner of Uppaline and Camp, surrounded by wooden homes and the dim glow of oil lamps. The Maggios lived in the rooms behind the store like many Italian-American families at the time. It was a simple arrangement, shop in front, living quarters behind, practical and safe. But safety proved fragile. Sometime after midnight, an intruder slipped inside. He moved with deliberation, not forcing doors or smashing windows. He simply removed a panel from the back door with surprisingly little noise. Inside, he found a kitchen, a narrow passageway, and then the bedroom where the couple slept. They never heard him. Joseph was struck first, the blade cutting deep. Catherine soon after. The blows came with startling force. The bedroom walls caught the echoes. The homes nearby remained quiet. The killer left the weapon, the Maggio's own axe, discarded in the adjoining room, wiped once but still stained. That was the pattern that would come to define him. A weapon taken from the home, never brought with him. Police were baffled. Robbery wasn't the motive. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of a struggle. And there was a strange detail. The intruder had also used a razor, one borrowed from Joseph's barber tools, to make precise cuts the axe alone couldn't manage. It was unnecessary. It was controlled. It showed a confidence that unsettled detectives. The city murmured about the crime for days, but New Orleans was no stranger to violence. People whispered, then moved on. The killer didn't. In early August, he struck again. This time the victim was a grocer named Louis Bissumer, attacked alongside his mistress, Anna. Their store sat near the edge of town, the kind of place where neighbors stopped for bread, fruit, or a quick conversation. Like the Maggios, they lived behind a shop. And just like before, the attacker bypassed locks and bolts with unsettling ease. Bissumer survived the assault long enough to speak to investigators. His words were confused, drifting between memory and pain. Anna remained unconscious, her injuries severe. The scene was almost identical, a back panel removed, an axe from the house used with violent efficiency. Detectives compared the two cases. They noticed the similarities. Some believed a pattern was forming. Others hesitated. Two attacks were unsettling, but not enough to call it a serial predator. The attacker waited only 9 days before making his intentions clear. He entered the home of Edward Schneider, a quiet man who worked long hours and returned home late. His pregnant wife slept soundly in their bedroom, unaware of the danger approaching. The killer's method was familiar now, a stealthy entry, a sudden eruption of violence, a retreat into the night. She survived astonishingly. She described a shadowed figure towering over her, the glint of an axe raised high. Her words added something new to the case, the first definitive glimpse of the attacker's presence. Newspapers began calling him the Axeman, a name that spread quickly through the neighborhoods. Windows were reinforced. Families nailed extra boards across their doors. Hardware stores sold out of locks in a matter of hours. People stayed awake at night, listening to the creaks of their homes, convinced the next attack was imminent. And it was. The Axeman didn't choose victims based on wealth. He didn't choose them based on age, but there was a pattern. Small grocery stores, usually run by Italian immigrants, especially those of Sicilian descent. Whether this was prejudice, opportunity, or coincidence remained unclear, but to the community, it didn't matter. Fear grew like mold in the summer heat. In March 1919, the Axemen attacked the court of Genoa grocery run by Rose and Charles Cortimiglia. The assault was brutal. Their daughter, Mary, was found lifeless in her crib. Rose survived. Charles survived. But the grief in that home settled like a permanent fog. Their case shook the city. The Axemen had struck families before, but the killing of a child ignited public panic. Papers printed warnings in bold type. Police patrols doubled in the Italian districts. Men sat awake with shotguns across their knees. Neighbors took turns watching the streets. The Axemen watched, too. Then something unusual happened. The Times-Picayune received a letter, one written in a voice that felt theatrical, almost taunting. The writer claimed to be the Axeman himself, though whether the letter came from the killer or a cruel hoax remains a mystery even now. It spoke of demons, of jazz, of murder, and it made a promise. On a specific night, the Axeman claimed he would pass through New Orleans again, but he would spare any home filled with jazz music. It was an eerie, almost surreal threat. That night, the city transformed. Every bar, every parlor, every apartment flooded the streets with music. Jazz bands played into the early hours. Phonographs spun endlessly. Even homes that could not afford instruments sang along with their neighbors. The city became one sprawling soundtrack, as if sound itself could hold back the killer. No one was attacked that night, but the Axeman returned weeks later. The home of Mike and Esther Pepitone became his final known target. The attack was savage. Blood splattered across the room in sweeping patterns. A crucifix on the wall was coated in dark streaks. Esther awoke to the sight of a figure fleeing into the night, the outline disappearing into the humid darkness. Pepitone died at the scene. His killer vanished. After that night, the Axemen seemed to evaporate. No more break-ins. No more slashed doors. No more violence. The city held its breath for months, waiting for another attack. But the silence lingered. Eventually, people locked their windows a little less tightly. Streetcars resumed their familiar rattling rhythm. Jazz floated easily again through warm nights. Life moved on, but the Axeman remained a shadow in the city's memory, a figure who stepped into New Orleans, carved terror into its streets, and then slipped away as if he'd never existed at all. No suspect was ever convicted, no identity confirmed, no motive proven, just a pattern of broken doors, discarded axes, and nights when fear wrapped itself tightly around the city, leaving behind a mystery that still feels heavy more than a century later. Next up is Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel Killer. London, 1888. Fog rolled down the narrow streets of Whitechapel, curling around gas lamps and the legs of late-night laborers. The city never slept, yet the alleys were quiet in ways that felt unnatural. Horses clattered along cobblestones. Doors banged in the wind. Somewhere, a cart squealed as it carried refuse through the narrow byways. But behind the noise, the dark pulse of the city throbbed in silence. It began with women disappearing. Prostitutes, mainly, working the impoverished streets of Whitechapel. They were known to the locals by first names or nicknames. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth. They lived hard lives, yet their fates were harsher than the streets they navigated. Many relied on the cover of night to find clients, moving through lanes no one else dared. The first canonical victim, widely recognized by historians, was Mary Ann Nichols. She was found in Bucks Row early in the morning. Her body lay in the mud, her throat slashed, injuries precise. The sight was enough to unnerve even hardened policemen. The knife work suggested someone with knowledge of anatomy, a hand steady, practice cruelly deliberate. Newspapers called it a murder than a series. Fear gripped Whitechapel. Women stayed home if they could. Those who worked could not. Their lives depended on earning a few pence to survive. Yet they walked streets that felt suddenly alive with shadowy menace. Everyone knew something had changed, something that could not be ignored. Within weeks, Annie Chapman became the next known victim. Found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, her throat was cut, abdomen mutilated. She was discovered early in the morning by a passerby who assumed she had collapsed in drunken slumber. The police quickly realized the pattern. The killer had a signature: precision, audacity, and terror wrapped together in each act. Whitechapel was alive with rumors. Men whispered at pub tables, arguing over the identity of the murderer. Women moved in groups, clutching shawls tight and heads down. Children fled from the alleys where they usually played. The city's population was aware of the invisible predator, but powerless to stop him. The police, divided and under pressure from the public, struggled. Scotland Yard dispatched inspectors. Officers patrolled the streets. Plainclothes detectives walked the alleys. Yet the killer eluded capture. His movements were unpredictable. He struck at night, then vanished before anyone could notice his approach. In each case, there were witnesses, but none could provide descriptions beyond fleeting glimpses of shadows, hats, or the glint of a knife. Then came Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, murdered on the same night in September 1888. The so-called double event confirmed what many had feared. The killer was escalating, bold, and perhaps growing more confident. Stride's body was found with her throat slashed, but without the abdominal mutilations common in prior victims. Eddowes, discovered hours later in Mitre Square, was brutally mutilated. Her face and abdomen bore evidence of precise knife work, almost surgical in execution. Letters began arriving at Scotland Yard and newspapers. The most famous, known as the Dear Boss letter, taunted the police and the public alike. Written in red ink, it proclaimed that the writer would continue killing. It signed the name that would endure in history, Jack the Ripper. Some believed the letters were hoaxes. Others thought they came from the killer himself. The mystery only deepened. The city reacted in tension. Whitechapel was patrolled at night by volunteers as well as police. Residents stayed indoors. Windows were shuttered. The killer's presence lingered even when he was not visible. Newspapers ran sensational stories, headlines dripping with horror, speculation, and rumor. Crowds gathered at crime scenes, gawking, whispering. Women shared tips cautiously. Some whispered warnings. Others dare not speak at all. The remaining canonical victims, Mary Jane Kelly, Alice Mackenzie, Annie Millwood, and others whose names have faded, were found in grim conditions. Kelly's murder, in particular, was the most horrific. Her room at Miller's Court revealed the full extent of the killer's ferocity. Her body mutilated beyond recognition, organs removed, evidence suggesting a level of knowledge in anatomy and an audacity that shocked the police. Detectives sought leads everywhere. They questioned doctors, butchers, cab drivers, anyone who might have seen strange figures in the alleyways. They set traps, sent plainclothes officers to patrol the streets, and offered rewards. Public anxiety grew as the killings continued. Some victims' clients were questioned. Some witnesses gave contradictory statements. The fog, the darkness, and the crowded streets all worked in the killer's favor. Theories multiplied. Some suspected local doctors, surgeons, or men with anatomical knowledge. Others suggested laborers with knives or criminals familiar with the alleys. Yet no one was ever arrested for certain. The Ripper vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Some letters stopped arriving. Some murders remained unclaimed. Scotland Yard eventually scaled back investigations, though unofficial efforts continued. The true identity of Jack the Ripper has never been confirmed. Modern historians and criminologists speculate. Theories range from skilled surgeons to butchers, from dockworkers to nobility. Some letters, like the From Hell correspondence, reveal horrific insight and handwriting analysis, yet the truth remains elusive. Each theory is compelling, yet none conclusively proven. The atmosphere of Whitechapel in 1888 cannot be overstated. The streets themselves seem to have absorbed the tension, the fear, the uncertainty. Gas lamps flickered as if warning. Cobblestones echoed footsteps that might or might not have been the Rippers. The population's daily life was punctuated by anxiety and rumor. The city itself became complicit in hiding the killer, a labyrinth of narrow alleys, shadowed corners, and crowded housing that allowed him to strike repeatedly. Even a modern mind struggles to comprehend it fully. The killings spread across Whitechapel and the East End remain both factual and legend. Each victim represents a life taken abruptly, violently, and with premeditation. Each discovery forced the city to confront the fragility of existence in crowded, impoverished neighborhoods. And yet, the Ripper never left a trace that could definitively identify him. Jack the Ripper's murders ceased as suddenly as they began. Some theorize he moved on, fled the city, or was imprisoned for an unrelated crime. Others speculate death ended a spree. The uncertainty has fueled decades of research, books, films, and endless fascination. Yet for the people of Whitechapel in 1888, the terror was immediate, raw, and unrelenting. Walking the streets of Whitechapel today, it is easy to imagine gas lamps flickering on foggy nights. Alleys twist in ways that feel familiar to history. Guides recount stories of victims, warn of shadowed corners, and trace the steps of a killer who struck without pattern, motive, or remorse. The city survived. The people adapted. Life went on. But the fog, the narrow alleys, and the memory of the Ripper's strikes remained stitched into the fabric of Whitechapel. Every shadowed corner and quiet street seems to whisper, "Beware the unseen." Next story, Belle Gunness, the murder farm of L.A. Port. In the quiet fields outside La Porte, Indiana, the air smelled faintly of earth and wood smoke. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the farmland, and the barns and cottages seemed ordinary, peaceful, almost quaint. But behind one unassuming farmhouse, a darkness persisted that would shock the nation. Belle Gunness, a woman of unusual stature and quiet charm, lived on that farm with her children. To neighbors, she appeared industrious, strong, and independent, a widow running a farm after the death of her husband. Her house was tidy, her manners polite, and her smiles were warm. But beneath the surface, the life of Belle Gunness was anything but ordinary. Gunness victims were often men who answered her newspaper ads. She advertised herself as a lonely widow seeking companionship, promising warmth, domestic comfort, and the chance for partnership in her modest farm. Men traveled from distant towns, drawn by her words, by the hope of a home and a new life. They arrived trusting, perhaps even hopeful, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Her method was deliberate. Men were allowed to settle in, to feel welcome. Then the killings began. Blows to the head, suffocation, sometimes poison. Money and valuables disappeared afterward. Belle's farm, large and isolated, allowed her to bury victims without attracting notice. Some were placed in the barn, others in the woodshed, still others under the floorboards. Over time, it became impossible for the locals to count. The first confirmed victim is believed to be Peter Gunness, her husband. He died under circumstances reported as a violent accident, but inconsistencies in witness accounts and the strange lack of grief from Belle sparked suspicion after the fact. His death set a precedent for what would follow: bodies disappearing, explanations conveniently arranged, and no immediate detection. Belle continued her life on the farm. She hired workers, entertained suitors, and maintained appearances of normalcy. Yet the list of missing men grew. She was careful, clever, and manipulative. Each new visitor brought opportunity, each interaction a potential profit. Some came for romance, some for the promise of land or work. All disappeared. Her murders were not limited to men. Later investigations revealed that children in her household may have been victims as well. Some were found buried in shallow graves around the property, their deaths suspicious, unexplained. Belle maintained control over the household and the farm, enforcing routines that masked the horror beneath. In 1908, the tragedy became public. A fire engulfed her house. Neighbors arrived to help, but when the flames died, bodies were discovered. The remains of Gunness' children were among them, along with evidence suggesting multiple adult victims. The scale was horrifying, dozens potentially dead buried across the property. The fire had revealed only a fraction of her crimes. Belle herself disappeared. Some claimed she had perished in the fire, but later evidence suggested otherwise. A body was found on the property, thought to be hers, but it was not conclusively identified. Reports surfaced of sightings elsewhere. In Chicago, in other states, always a rumor, never verified. The mystery of her fate added another layer of terror to the story. Investigators combed the farm for clues. They found financial records, letters, and documents that suggested her elaborate scheme to attract victims for wealth and advantage. Homespun advertisements, polite invitations, and social charm had masked a violent, calculating mind. She had manipulated trust, exploited vulnerability, and escaped detection until catastrophe revealed the truth. Neighbors recalled her with mixed emotions. A woman of strength and industry, polite and engaging, yet always slightly off, almost unmoored from ordinary morality. Farmhands described her as meticulous, controlling, and eerily calm in moments that would unsettle others. Children, if they survived, were quiet, reserved, wary of strangers, a reflection of the tension that had permeated the household. Newspapers seized on the story, publishing lurid details of the murders and the fire. The nation was fascinated. Letters and inquiries poured in from curious readers, investigators, and amateur detectives. Belle Gunness became a name synonymous with cunning and cruelty. Her story was retold countless times, growing in infamy, a cautionary tale of charm, isolation, and lethal intent. The farm itself changed over time. Crops grew, barns were repaired, and life attempted to resume normal rhythms. Yet the ground retained a memory, a secret that could never be erased. Visitors remarked on the stillness, the uncanny quiet that seemed heavier than ordinary country life. Ghost stories sprouted, rumors of strange sightings, unexplained noises, and a lingering sense of a watchful presence. Even today, Belle Gunness is remembered not just for her murders, but for her ingenuity in concealment, her manipulation of trust, and the audacity to exploit societal blind spots. Her methods, seduction, deception, and control, allowed her to operate for years, unseen, her crimes almost undetectable until the fire. The story resonates because it combines calculated human cruelty with domestic normalcy. The farmhouse could have belonged to any industrious widow. The neighbors could have been anyone's neighbors. And yet, behind polite greetings, routine chores, and the hum of farm life, violence and death unfolded. Belle Gunness became a shadow on the landscape of Lawport, a reminder that horror can wear a familiar face. Walking the countryside today, the land feels ordinary, serene. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the soil and the stories, lie secrets that were never fully uncovered. Graves unmarked, victims uncounted, a woman vanished. Belle Gunness remains a figure suspended between history and legend. Her life and crimes a puzzle that continues to fascinate. Next story, Papin Sisters, the Murderous Maids. Le Mans, France, 1933. The quiet of the French town was punctuated by the clatter of horseshoes and the occasional carriage wheel. The streets were narrow, lined with modest homes, bakeries, and shops. Sunlight dappled cobblestones in the afternoon, and smoke from wood fires carried through the air. Everything seemed ordinary, peaceful even, but behind one elegant, well-kept house on Rue Bruyère, darkness festered. It was the home of Genevieve and Christine Lancelin, daughters of a prosperous physician, where two young women, Christine and Leah Papin, worked as maids. On the surface, their lives seemed typical: service, obedience, and the quiet rhythm of domestic labor. Yet beneath the routine, tension simmered, unnoticed by neighbors and employers alike. The Papin sisters were inseparable, their bond intense, bordering on obsessive. They shared a room, meals, and the minutiae of life with remarkable closeness. But their relationship with the family they served was complicated. The sisters were skilled, diligent, efficient. Yet small slights, criticisms, or corrections could spark disproportionate anger. Every instruction from Madame Lancelin, every casual comment, seemed to weigh heavily on the sisters, lingering long after it was spoken. On the morning of February 2nd, 1933, the household awoke to an ordinary routine. Breakfast prepared, fires stoked, beds made. But tension had reached an invisible peak. Words were exchanged between Madame Lancelin and Christine Papin over something minor, the polishing of silver or the arrangement of linens. The argument escalated silently, a slow-burning fuse neither adult nor maid fully recognized. Then, violence erupted. Christine struck first, suddenly, with a fury that shocked in its intensity. Madame Lancelin fell, and Leah joined, the two acting with terrifying synchronicity. The blows were unrelenting, precise, almost ritualistic. Furniture was overturned in the struggle. In moments, Madame Lancelin lay lifeless. Her daughter, Genevieve, tried to intervene, but was struck down in the same torrent of violence. Their screams, muffled by the heavy walls, ended abruptly. Afterward, the sisters lingered, surveying the scene. Blood coated the floors, the furniture, their hands. The violence had been swift, decisive, yet strangely methodical. The maids did not flee. They moved through the house with a tense, eerie calm, washing tools, cleaning the kitchen, and closing doors as if life had not been interrupted. Outside, the world remained unaware. Passers-by would have seen nothing unusual. The doors closed quietly, the windows intact, the smoke from the chimney rising as normal. Neighbors grew suspicious only later in the day. The Lancelin family did not emerge. A neighbor, noticing the unusual silence, sent someone to check the house. What they found was horror. 2 bodies, the room drenched in blood, and 2 sisters sitting quietly nearby, awaiting the authorities. They were calm, almost indifferent. Their confessions were immediate, matter of fact. The act had been personal, almost intimate in its execution, born of accumulated resentment and psychological intensity. The case stunned France. 2 young women, often described as polite, diligent, and obedient, had committed murder with an intensity that seemed impossible. Psychologists, journalists, and law enforcement studied the sisters, attempting to understand motivation. Some pointed to childhood trauma, isolation, or a shared psychological disorder. Others emphasized social pressures and class tensions, the complex hierarchies of servants and employers in early 20th century France. In court, the sisters' closeness was evident. Christine, the elder, dominated, orchestrating the narrative. Leah seemed to follow, her movements and words mirroring her sisters'. Their bond had been extreme, private, and ultimately lethal. Witnesses recounted the tension in the household. Small irritations escalating, suppressed anger, and the sisters' isolation from the outside world. No one could have predicted the violent eruption that would follow. The trial drew intense public attention. The details of the murders, the psychological assessments, and the shocking nature of the act fascinated a nation. Debate raged about culpability, the influence of shared mental conditions, and the social dynamics of domestic service. Were the sisters fully responsible, or were they products of circumstance, pushed to extremes by environment and repression? Christine Papin was sentenced to life in prison. Leah received a slightly shorter sentence due to her perceived submissiveness in the crime. They were separated, their bond broken forcibly by the state. Yet the story lingered in French society, discussed in cafes, newspapers, and academic circles. It was a case that combined raw violence, psychological complexity, and social observation in a way that few other crimes had. The house itself was later abandoned, left as a reminder of the dark event that had occurred within its walls. Neighbors avoided it. Locals whispered of strange noises, lingering scents, and the sense of watching eyes. Even decades later, the story of the Papin sisters remained a potent mix of horror, fascination, and unease, a domestic nightmare frozen in time. Their crimes became a cultural touchstone. Writers, sociologists, and psychologists reference the case as an extreme example of familial obsession, social tension, and psychological pathology. The sisters' bond, previously invisible and private, had erupted into public horror with consequences that reverberated far beyond Le Mans. The Papin sisters remind us that terror is not always monstrous in appearance. It can be hidden in ordinary domesticity, in polite service, in everyday routine. Violence may erupt where least expected, leaving behind the shock of innocence lost, of trust violated, and the quiet streets of Le Mans haunted by events that never fully fade. Next story, Papin sisters, the murderous maids. Le Mans, France, 1933. The quiet of the French town was punctuated by the clatter of horseshoes and the occasional carriage wheel. The streets were narrow, lined with modest homes, bakeries, and shops. Sunlight dappled cobblestones in the afternoon, and smoke from wood fires carried through the air. Everything seemed ordinary, peaceful even, but behind one elegant, well-kept house on Rue Bruyère, darkness festered. It was the home of Genevieve and Christine Lancelin, daughters of a prosperous physician, where two young women, Christine and Leah Papin, worked as maids. On the surface, their lives seemed typical: service, obedience, and the quiet rhythm of domestic labor. Yet beneath the routine, tension simmered, unnoticed by neighbors and employers alike. The Papin sisters were inseparable, their bond intense, bordering on obsessive. They shared a room, meals, and the minutiae of life with remarkable closeness. But their relationship with the family they served was complicated. The sisters were skilled, diligent, efficient. Yet small slights, criticisms, or corrections could spark disproportionate anger. Every instruction from Madame Lancelin, every casual comment, seemed to weigh heavily on the sisters, lingering long after it was spoken. On the morning of February 2nd, 1933, the household awoke to an ordinary routine. Breakfast prepared, fires stoked, beds made. But tension had reached an invisible peak. Words were exchanged between Madame Lancelin and Christine Papin over something minor: the polishing of silver or the arrangement of linens. The argument escalated silently, a slow-burning fuse neither adult nor maid fully recognized. Then violence erupted. Christine struck first, suddenly, with a fury that shocked in its intensity. Madame Lancelin fell, and Leah joined, the two acting with terrifying synchronicity. The blows were unrelenting, precise, almost ritualistic. Furniture was overturned in the struggle. In moments, Madame Lancelin lay lifeless. Her daughter, Genevieve, tried to intervene, but was struck down in the same torrent of violence. Their screams, muffled by the heavy walls, ended abruptly. Afterward, the sisters lingered, surveying the scene. Blood coated the floors, the furniture, their hands. The violence had been swift, decisive, yet strangely methodical. The maids did not flee. They moved through the house with a tense, eerie calm, washing tools, cleaning the kitchen, and closing doors as if life had not been interrupted. Outside, the world remained unaware. Passers-by would have seen nothing unusual. The doors closed quietly, the windows intact, the smoke from the chimney rising as normal. Neighbors grew suspicious only later in the day. The Lancelin family did not emerge. A neighbor, noticing the unusual silence, sent someone to check the house. What they found was horror. Two bodies, the room drenched in blood, and two sisters sitting quietly nearby, awaiting the authorities. They were calm, almost indifferent. Their confessions were immediate, matter of fact. The act had been personal, almost intimate in its execution, born of accumulated resentment and psychological intensity. The case stunned France. Two young women, often described as polite, diligent, and obedient, had committed murder with an intensity that seemed impossible. Psychologists, journalists, and law enforcement studied the sisters, attempting to understand motivation. Some pointed to childhood trauma, isolation, or a shared psychological disorder. Others emphasized social pressures and class tensions, the complex hierarchies of servants and employers in early 20th century France. In court, the sisters' closeness was evident. Christine, the elder, dominated, orchestrating the narrative. Leah seemed to follow, her movements and words mirroring her sister's. Their bond had been extreme, private, and ultimately lethal. Witnesses recounted the tension in the household. Small irritations escalating, suppressed anger, and the sisters' isolation from the outside world. No one could have predicted the violent eruption that would follow. The trial drew intense public attention. The details of the murders, the psychological assessments, and the shocking nature of the act fascinated a nation. Debate raged about culpability, the influence of shared mental conditions, and the social dynamics of domestic service. Were the sisters fully responsible, or were they products of circumstance, pushed to extremes by environment and repression? Christine Papin was sentenced to life in prison. Leah received a slightly shorter sentence due to her perceived submissiveness in the crime. They were separated, their bond broken forcibly by the state. Yet the story lingered in French society, discussed in cafes, newspapers, and academic circles. It was a case that combined raw violence, psychological complexity, and social observation in a way that few other crimes had. The house itself was later abandoned, left as a reminder of the dark event that had occurred within its walls. Neighbors avoided it. Locals whispered of strange noises, lingering scents, and the sense of watching eyes. Even decades later, the story of the Papin sisters remained a potent mix of horror, fascination, and unease, a domestic nightmare frozen in time. Their crimes became a cultural touchstone. Writers, sociologists, and psychologists reference the case as an extreme example of familial obsession, social tension, and psychological pathology. The sisters' bond, previously invisible and private, had erupted into public horror with consequences that reverberated far beyond Le Mans. The Papin sisters remind us that terror is not always monstrous in appearance. It can be hidden in ordinary domesticity, in polite service, in everyday routine. Violence may erupt where least expected, leaving behind the shock of innocence lost, of trust violated, and the quiet streets of Le Mans haunted by events that never fully fade. Next story, Julia Wallace, the murder of the Liverpool lawyer. Liverpool, England, in the 1930s was a city of fog, shipping docks, and narrow streets lined with brick houses. The hum of the port carried across the Mersey, mixing with the cries of seagulls and the occasional rumble of a tram. Life moved with routine, work, and commerce, but behind the facades of respectable homes, secrets sometimes simmered. One such secret would erupt with violence that shocked the nation. At 29 Wolverton Street lived William Herbert Wallace and his wife, Julia Wallace. William was a middle-aged insurance agent, known for his polite demeanor and steady income. Julia, vibrant yet reserved, maintained the home and managed daily life with precision. Together, they projected the image of a conventional, respectable middle-class couple, orderly, disciplined, and seemingly untouched by misfortune. On the night of January 19, 1931, the rhythm of their household was interrupted. William left the house to walk to a supposed meeting arranged earlier in the day. He never returned when expected. Neighbors noted the unusual absence. We did arrive later that evening. He was visibly shaken. What followed would become one of Britain's most notorious unsolved murders. Julia Wallace was discovered brutally murdered in her home. She had been struck repeatedly with a heavy instrument, a hammer or hatchet-like object. Her injuries were severe, inflicted with force and precision. The scene was chaotic, yet contained. Furniture displaced, blood everywhere, but no sign of forced entry. The crime suggested careful planning, yet also rage. Liverpool's police were immediately involved. Detectives combed the house for evidence, examining every detail: footprints, fingerprints, broken objects, and traces of blood. The weapon was never definitively recovered. The absence of forced entry perplexed investigators. The killer must have been known or had means to gain access without detection. Every clue seemed to raise more questions than answers. William Wallace became both a witness and a suspect. He claimed to have received a mysterious phone call earlier in the day, instructing him to visit a location in Liverpool to collect money. He complied, believing it legitimate. When he returned, his wife was already dead. Police scrutinized his story, attempting to verify his movements, examine phone records, and establish timelines. Some inconsistencies emerged, though they were subtle, and the line between guilt and innocence blurred. The murder gained national attention. Newspapers detailed the scene, speculated on motives, and published interviews with neighbors and acquaintances. Julia Wallace became the face of a tragic mystery. A woman killed in her own home. Her life ended violently in a place that should have been safe. The public was captivated by both the brutality of the act and the enigma of its perpetrator. Investigators explored numerous theories. One suggested that the murder was orchestrated to frame William Wallace, exploiting his absence and the unusual phone call. Another proposed that a burglar or criminal opportunist, familiar with the neighborhood, carried out the attack with cold precision. The lack of motive made the case confounding. Money, valuables, and personal items were untouched. The brutality of the attack seemed personal, yet the apparent randomness confounded investigators. Interviews with neighbors revealed glimpses of the household dynamic. Julia Wallace was described as organized, friendly, and careful. William Wallace was diligent, methodical, and cautious. Both were respected by those around them. Yet, in small towns and cities, the ordinary can hide extraordinary tension. Investigators considered personal vendettas, jealous acquaintances, or opportunistic criminals, but no evidence pointed conclusively to any one theory. The trial that followed was unique. William Wallace was eventually charged with his wife's murder, largely due to circumstantial evidence and public pressure. The prosecution emphasized the unusual details, the mysterious phone call, William's movements, and minor inconsistencies in testimony. The defense countered meticulously, highlighting lack of motive, absence of direct evidence, and the possibility of another perpetrator entirely. The courtroom was packed, journalists filling every available seat. Observers noted the contrast between William's calm composure and the horror of the crime he was accused of. Witnesses recounted events, timeline discrepancies, and physical evidence, yet nothing conclusively linked him to the murder. Experts debated psychological profiles, likelihoods of planning, and possible criminal methods. Ultimately, the jury found William Wallace not guilty. The case remained officially unsolved. The acquittal left many in Liverpool unsettled, questioning justice, evidence, and the unknown identity of the killer. Some locals whispered suspicions that never found confirmation. Others speculated that Wallace had been guilty, but clever enough to elude detection. Still, no definitive answer emerged. The story of Julia Wallace has endured for decades. Historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts continue to analyze the case. The telephone call, the unusual timing, and the method of the attack remain topics of discussion. The mystery is compounded by the fact that the killer's identity was never discovered, leaving a sense of unresolved tension that persists in the narrative of Liverpool's criminal history. Walking through Wolverton Street today, it is easy to imagine the quiet houses, the ordinary routines, and the subtle threat of an intruder. Gas lamps are gone, replaced by modern lighting. Trams and cars move where horses once trotted. Yet the memory of Julia Wallace's murder lingers, carried in stories, local lore, and the archives of newspapers that chronicle the crime. What makes this case compelling is the combination of domestic normalcy, meticulous investigation, and enduring mystery. Julia Wallace was killed in her own home, a place meant to provide safety. The attack was sudden, brutal, and precise, yet the identity of the perpetrator remains unknown. William Wallace's acquittal only deepened the intrigue, leaving a narrative suspended between fact and speculation. The crime also underscores the unpredictability of human behavior and the vulnerabilities inherent in everyday life. A quiet street, a respectable household, and ordinary routines became the backdrop for horror. The meticulous investigation, the courtroom drama, and the unanswered questions contribute to a narrative that continues to captivate historians and true crime enthusiasts alike. Even today, the the story is studied in law schools, criminology courses, and true crime discussions. The combination of domestic violence, psychological intrigue, and enduring mystery makes the Julia Wallace case unique. It is a story where ordinary life and extraordinary crime intersect, leaving a legacy that challenges understanding and invites ongoing exploration. Liverpool remembers. Streets, houses, and records preserve the memory. The identity of the killer is lost to history, but the events of that January day remain vivid and unsettling. Julia Wallace's life was ended violently, her story recorded for generations, a chilling example of how horror can emerge in the most ordinary settings. Next story, Phantom Killer, the Texarkana murder mystery. Texarkana, straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, was quiet in the spring of 1946. Streets were lined with modest homes, porches trimmed with peeling paint, and the hum of everyday life carried into the evening. Children played, neighbors waved, and the night air carried the distant rumble of a train on the outskirts of town. The city seemed ordinary, almost peaceful. But ordinary peace would not last. Something unseen, something violent, emerged from the shadows. The terror would be sudden, unpredictable, and leave the entire town gripped by fear. The first attack occurred on February 22nd, 1946. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Guthrie, teenagers out for a moonlit walk, were ambushed by a masked figure. The assailant, wielding a firearm, shot at the couple without warning. Jimmy survived, but Mary Jean was critically injured. The attacker vanished into the night, leaving only questions, fear, and the lingering echo of gunshots. Within days, the so-called Phantom Killer struck again. The murders were random, the victims seemingly chosen without pattern. Lovers walking at night, couples parked in cars, residents alone in their homes. All became potential targets. The anonymity of the assailant created a pervasive anxiety. Every shadow, every flicker of movement became a threat. The city's rhythm was altered. Doors were locked, windows bolted, and families kept children inside after dusk. Investigators were immediately challenged. Texarkana's police force was small, inexperienced with serial violence, and unprepared for the erratic nature of the attacks. They established night patrols, checkpoints, and curfews. Volunteers and deputies joined efforts, yet the phantom eluded capture. Reports of sightings were inconsistent, descriptions vague, and every lead seemed to vanish. The murders escalated in brutality. Victims were found in secluded areas, some shot, others beaten. Occasionally, homes were broken into, occupants attacked in their beds. The randomness intensified fear. There was no routine, no safe place. People became hyper-aware of their surroundings. Silence fell over the town at night. Conversations were whispered. Steps on porches made hearts race. Media attention heightened the tension. Newspapers dubbed the attacker the Phantom Killer, emphasizing his elusiveness and terror. Headlines screamed of murder, warning, and danger. Residents followed stories obsessively, while outsiders speculated on the identity of the assailant. The legend of the Phantom Killer grew as reports of sightings, mysterious cars, and shadowy figures circulated. Investigators examined every aspect. They tracked footprints, interviewed witnesses, and mapped attacks. Suspects were questioned. Local men with criminal histories were scrutinized, yet no one could be conclusively linked to the murders. The Phantom was careful, deliberate, and seemingly always one step ahead. Each night brought the possibility of new attacks, ensuring the entire community remained on edge. Among the most chilling attacks was the murder of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker in early March. The couple had parked on a secluded road when a masked figure appeared, shooting indiscriminately. Betty Jo survived, though wounded, while Paul Martin succumbed. The attack displayed both randomness and cold calculation. Investigators noted that the Phantom showed familiarity with the town's outskirts, yet could strike and disappear without trace. Public fear intensified. Residents traveled in groups, carried firearms, and avoided isolated roads. Teens curbed evening walks. The streets, once ordinary, became corridors of anxiety. Families whispered, neighbors watched, and the town's social fabric shifted under the weight of unseen violence. Law enforcement employed innovative tactics for the era. Checkpoints, decoy vehicles, and undercover officers attempted to intercept the phantom. Investigators analyzed ballistic evidence, footprints, and witness sketches. Every detail was scrutinized. The challenge was the killer's unpredictability. No patterns, no routine. The very randomness was a weapon, making anticipation nearly impossible. The phantom's psychological profile began to emerge. Cold, methodical, opportunistic, and driven by a compulsion to kill. There was no apparent motive beyond violence itself. The attacks instilled fear, but also fascination. Rumors of the assailant's identity spread. Local men, drifters, soldiers returning from war. Every stranger was a potential suspect. Every shadow could hide death. As weeks passed, Texarkana adapted to the threat. Lights were kept on through the night. Community watches formed. Families installed locks and alarms. The phantom, however, remained elusive. The randomness of attacks made vigilance exhausting and anxiety constant. Ordinary routines were abandoned or altered permanently. Investigators noted a chilling pattern. The attacks occurred in pairs, often targeting couples in isolated areas. Vehicles parked on country roads, homes near quiet streets, and anyone alone at night were at risk. Despite this, no single suspect emerged. No single clue pointed definitively to the phantom's identity. The case became emblematic of fear without resolution, terror that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. By summer 1946, attacks slowed, then stopped. No one ever captured the phantom killer. The case remained open, unsolved, and haunted Texarkana for decades. The memory of those nights, shadows in the streets, masked figures, sudden gunfire, remained vivid in the collective consciousness. Historians and criminologists continue to study the Texarkana attacks. The case illustrates the impact of unpredictability, the psychology of fear, and the challenges small towns face when confronted by calculated, elusive violence. The phantom killer remains a symbol of terror unbound, a reminder that sometimes horror is not contained in motive, but in randomness and anonymity. Walking the quiet roads today, it is easy to imagine the fog rolling in, the flicker of headlights in the darkness, the echo of footsteps, and the uncertainty that gripped every resident. Texarkana's ordinary streets were transformed by terror, leaving a legacy of fear, fascination, and unsolved questions. The Phantom Killer's story endures because of the combination of human vulnerability, unpredictability, and the unseen nature of the threat. No identity, no confession, and no resolution could erase the impact of the attacks. Texarkana, small yet resilient, remains a city defined in part by the shadow of a figure who struck without warning and vanished without trace. In the end, the case persists in memory, study, and legend. It is a chilling reminder that violence can emerge without reason, that fear can reshape a community, and that some mysteries may never be solved. Next story, Black Dahlia, the murder of Elizabeth Short. Los Angeles, 1947. The city was alive with neon, post-war energy, and the hum of traffic that stretched from Sunset Boulevard to the outskirts of the valley. Movie premieres, diners, and palm-lined streets gave an air of glamour. Yet beneath the surface, the city carried shadows, alleys, backstreets, and a growing tension that would soon erupt into one of America's most infamous unsolved murders. Elizabeth Short was a young woman of 22, bright, ambitious, and determined to pursue a life in Hollywood. She had traveled from Massachusetts in search of opportunity. Her optimism was reflected in her appearance. Carefully styled hair, fashionable clothes, and a wide smile that masked uncertainty. Short dreamed of acting, of a life beyond the ordinary, and she sought friends, work, and recognition in a city that promised both glamour and danger. The morning of January 15th, 1947, began unremarkably. Los Angeles awakened under the chill of winter. Streets glistened with frost in low-lying areas, and the occasional early commuter hurried past neon-lit cafes. But in a vacant lot on South Norton Avenue, a body was discovered. Elizabeth Short lay mutilated, her body grotesquely bisected at the waist. The brutality was shocking, the precision of the cuts almost surgical. Limbs arranged deliberately, hands placed beside her head, her dark hair spread across the dirt like a halo of shadow. Detectives arrived, quickly overwhelmed by the scene. The crime was unprecedented in scale and detail. Police cordoned off the area, but the media descended almost immediately. Photographers captured the body, reporters rushed to collect statements from neighbors, and the story exploded across newspapers nationwide. Headlines screamed of horror, mystery, and the macabre. The Black Dahlia, they called her, a name born from fascination and rumor, inspired by her penchant for black attire and the popular film of the same era. Investigators combed the area for clues. Footprints in the dirt, tire tracks near the lot, and a small, discarded personal item were analyzed. Yet nothing offered a definitive lead. Witnesses were scarce. The lot was isolated, the crime executed with care. Whoever had committed this act had knowledge, skill, or at least a bold disregard for consequences. The precision of the bisecting, the arrangement of the body, suggested meticulous planning, a chilling combination of rage and calculated intent. Elizabeth's life was examined. Friends, acquaintances, and former roommates were interviewed. She had been ambitious, moving in circles of young hopefuls and struggling performers. Some described her as confident, others as vulnerable. Rumors of relationships, parties, and late-night outings painted a picture of a young woman navigating a city full of opportunity and hidden danger. Investigators sought motive: jealousy, revenge, passion, or desire for notoriety. Each avenue led to dead ends or speculation. The brutality of the murder shocked Los Angeles. Hospitals, morgues, and police stations reported an influx of inquiries from concerned citizens. Psychologists and criminologists began analyzing the case, attempting to profile the killer. Cold, meticulous, and possibly familiar with anatomical knowledge, the perpetrator had left little trace beyond the grisly scene. The sheer audacity of the crime created fear among residents, particularly young women navigating the city alone at night. Media coverage amplified the horror. Every detail of Elizabeth's life and death was dissected. Newspapers published daily updates, interviews with neighbors, and photographs of the vacant lot where her body had been found. Sensationalism fed public fascination, and the case became a national story, emblematic of the dark undercurrents of post-war Los Angeles. Rumors spread of secret lovers, jealous rivals, and anonymous threats. The city's streets, once ordinary, were imbued with suspicion. Detective work intensified. Leads were followed across the city, tracing Elizabeth's movements in the days leading up to her death. She had been seen at nightclubs, cafes, and bus stations. Friends provided conflicting accounts of her whereabouts. Investigators examined letters, phone records, and hotel logs. Each clue offered a fragment of possibility, yet no concrete suspect emerged. The killer remained invisible, the motive unclear, the method horrifyingly precise. Public fear grew. Young women altered routines, avoiding travel at night, and families instructed daughters to remain close to home. The Black Dahlia case became more than a murder. It became a symbol of vulnerability in a city that promised fame but delivered shadows. The randomness, the audacity, and the graphic nature of the crime created a pervasive sense of unease. As weeks turned into months, investigators pursued hundreds of leads. Suspects were questioned, including men who had known Elizabeth personally or were connected to her social circles. Some were released due to lack of evidence. Others were dismissed as unreliable. Each dead and added to the sense of mystery and frustration. The brutality, the precision, and the lack of motive remained confounding. Despite decades of investigation, the case remains officially unsolved. Dozens of theories exist: jealous ex-lovers, criminal opportunists, psychologically disturbed individuals, or even law enforcement insiders. Books, documentaries, and films have explored the case in depth, each offering analysis, speculation, or reconstruction. Yet the truth, the identity of the killer, remains hidden, locked away in the shadows of history. Elizabeth Short's murder endures in cultural memory. The Black Dahlia has become emblematic of the dark side of human nature, the vulnerability of those seeking opportunity, and the chilling combination of meticulous planning and sudden, extreme violence. Psychologists examine the case as a study in obsession, criminal psychology, and post-war social dynamics. Historians contextualize it within the growth of Los Angeles as a city of stark contrasts: glamour and grime, ambition and danger, opportunity and menace. The crime also illustrates the limitations of mid-20th century forensic science. Fingerprints, blood analysis, and witness testimony were often the only tools available. Without modern DNA analysis, surveillance technology, or comprehensive databases, the killer could operate with relative impunity. The case is a stark reminder of both the audacity of violent individuals and the limitations of contemporary investigative methods. Walking through Los Angeles today, the streets are transformed. Neon still glows, but buildings are taller, cars replace streetcars, and palm trees shade modern sidewalks. Yet the legacy of the Black Dahlia remains. The empty lots, the shadowed alleys, and the stories told in whispers keep the memory alive. Tourists, true crime enthusiasts, and locals alike recount the events, aware that ordinary streets can conceal extraordinary horror. Even today, when the neon lights shine and the streets bustle, the memory of Elizabeth Short lingers. The Black Dahlia represents both the vulnerability of youth and ambition and the persistence of human curiosity. Her story captivates because it is unresolved, chilling, and intimately human, a reminder that horror often hides behind ordinary facades, waiting for a moment to emerge. Next story, Brides in the Bath, the murder of British wives. Early 20th century England. Streets were cobblestone, lined with gas lamps and modest brick houses. Trams rattled along rails, and shopkeepers opened windows to the morning bustle. Life appeared ordinary, orderly, and familiar. Yet behind closed doors, danger sometimes lurked where trust should have prevailed. George Joseph Smith was a man who blended into society seamlessly. To neighbors, he was polite, measured, respectable. He presented himself as a devoted husband, careful with money, and concerned for his families. In reality, he was a calculating predator, moving methodically through towns and households, selecting victims with precision. Smith's method was chillingly consistent. He courted women, often widows or those seeking companionship, married them quickly, and ingratiated himself into their lives. Once trust was secured, he arranged circumstances that would allow their deaths in seemingly accidental ways. Most often, he used drowning in the bath. It was an intimate, domestic setting, a place where no one would suspect malice. The first case emerged with Alice Burnham, married to Smith in 1908. She was found dead in the bathtub, initially thought to have drowned accidentally. Her death appeared mundane, unremarkable, a tragic, isolated incident. Medical authorities noted nothing out of the ordinary, attributing her demise to accident rather than foul play. Neighbors murmured condolences, but life moved on. Smith did not stop. He repeated the pattern, courting and marrying successive women. Each death followed similar lines: marriage, cohabitation, sudden drowning. Insurance policies were arranged quietly. Money exchanged hands after death. The repetition, invisible to outsiders, masked a deliberate pattern. Smith relied on the trust inherent in domestic relationships, exploiting ordinary routines to conceal extraordinary violence. By the early 1910s, medical examiners began noticing the similarities. Overlapping circumstances, rapid remarriages, and financial gains raised eyebrows. Investigators reviewed prior deaths, uncovering the unsettling repetition. Smith, however, continued to appear respectable, charming, and above suspicion. His ability to navigate societal norms while committing murder allowed him to evade detection for years. The breakthrough came after the death of Margaret Lofty in 1915. Forensic examination noted anomalies. The position of the body, bruising inconsistent with accidental drowning, and other physical evidence suggesting force rather than misfortune. Suspicion crystallized. Police investigated thoroughly, uncovering previous deaths connected to Smith. His pattern was undeniable. 3 wives, each drowned in bathtubs, each married quickly, each yielding financial benefit. Smith was arrested and charged. The trial, held at the Old Bailey, captivated the nation. Newspapers detailed the deaths, the methods, and the chilling consistency. The courtroom was tense, filled with journalists, family members, and curious onlookers. Smith maintained composure, asserting innocence, claiming accident, and portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. Prosecutors focused on the methodical nature of crimes. Expert witnesses describe how drowning in a bathtub could be engineered to appear accidental. Evidence of rapid remarriage, financial gain, and the precise timing of deaths created a compelling narrative of premeditated murder. Witnesses recounted behavior, patterns, and circumstances surrounding the victim's final days, emphasizing Smith's meticulous planning. The defense countered, emphasizing the difficulty of proving intent, the possibility of coincidence, and the limits of forensic science at the time. Yet the accumulation of evidence was overwhelming. The jury faced a case that balanced on circumstantial proof, expert testimony, and the eerie repetition of domestic deaths. The societal horror was palpable, a man exploiting the privacy and trust of domestic spaces to kill repeatedly. In 1915, Smith was convicted of murder. He received the death sentence. His execution in 1915 was witnessed by a crowd, many of whom had followed the case with fascination, horror, and disbelief. The story became emblematic of domestic vulnerability, the potential for deception, and the dangers that could hide behind the facade of ordinary life. The Brides in the Bath murders endure in historical memory for their combination of ordinary domesticity and extraordinary malevolence. Bathrooms, bedrooms, and private homes, spaces meant to provide safety, became tools of calculated destruction. Smith's manipulation of trust, routine, and expectation reveals the terrifying potential of ordinary settings for concealment of crime. Beyond the immediate horror, the case influenced legal and forensic approaches. Examiners developed methods for detecting subtle injuries, inconsistencies in drowning deaths, and patterns of repeated incidents. Investigators became more attuned to the domestic sphere as a potential site of repeated criminal activity. The case emphasized that violence could emerge not from public spaces, but from behind closed doors where scrutiny was minimal. Social implications were profound. Families, particularly women, were reminded that trust could be exploited. The public grappled with the idea that appearances could be deceiving, that charm, courtesy, and social respectability could mask lethal intent. It sparked debates in newspapers, among policymakers, and within the community about the vulnerability of women in domestic settings. Yet there is more than horror in the narrative. The Brides in the Bath case is also a study in human cunning, societal blind spots, and the evolution of crime detection. It illustrates how careful observation, forensic innovation, and cumulative evidence can unveil patterns hidden by everyday routines. The combination of psychological manipulation, methodical planning, and exploitation of trust defines the case as uniquely chilling. George Joseph Smith's life, trial, and execution serve as a stark reminder that ordinary life can mask extraordinary danger. The trust we place in domestic spaces, in seemingly respectable individuals, is both necessary and vulnerable. The victim's stories highlight not only the tragedy of early death, but also the systematic nature of predation within familiar environments. The legacy of the brides in the bath extends into literature, criminology, and historical study. Scholars examine Smith's psychological profile, methods, and societal context. True crime enthusiasts revisit the narrative, analyzing the sequence of murders, the subtleties of his planning, and the societal factors that allowed him to act undetected for years. Every detail, from the selection of victims to the meticulous drowning method, offers insight into criminal strategy and the vulnerabilities inherent in human behavior. Mary and Cotton, Lizzie Borden, and George Joseph Smith share an unsettling common thread: domestic familiarity exploited for lethal ends. But the Brides in the Bath case stands out for its precision, audacity, and the paradoxical intimacy of the murders. Bathtubs, places of private refuge, became instruments of calculated murder. Trust, routine, and social expectation were weaponized, leaving a mark on legal history and the collective imagination. For modern observers, the story resonates not merely as historical fact, but as a study in the manipulation of ordinary circumstances. It challenges assumptions about safety, about who can be trusted, and about how violence can be hidden behind the most mundane routines. Unlike sensationalized accounts of random street attacks, Smith's crimes were intimate, methodical, and deeply calculated, a slow, precise erosion of security within the home. The streets of early 20th century England remain unchanged in their quietude. Brick terraces, cobbled lanes, and gas lamps evoke ordinary life. Next story: Charles Bravo poisoning, the Victorian mystery. London, 1876. The city was a web of gaslit streets, cobblestones slick with rain, and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. Smoke from factories mingled with fog rolling in from the Thames, creating an air thick with uncertainty. Amid the bustle, domestic life continued quietly behind heavy doors, households maintaining appearances, families navigating social expectations, and servants moving silently through well-ordered homes. Charles Bravo was a man of property and status. Educated, refined, and part of London's middle-upper class, he married Florence Ricardo, a young woman from a respectable family. Their home at 20, Norfolk Square, was furnished in the typical Victorian style: heavy drapes, polished wood, and meticulous order. Yet within this domestic elegance, tensions simmered, and danger would emerge in a form both intimate and unexpected. The couple's marriage was strained from the beginning. Florence, accustomed to a more independent life, chafed under the strictures of Victorian domesticity. Charles, meticulous and controlling, grew frustrated with perceived slights and domestic inefficiencies. Arguments erupted, sometimes quietly, sometimes with intensity that left servants and neighbors uneasy. The marriage was marked by friction, but no one anticipated tragedy. On the evening of April 18th, 1876, Charles Bravo fell gravely ill. He experienced severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and an unrelenting weakness. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors were summoned immediately, but the cause was obscure. Victorian medicine, limited in diagnostic tools and reliant on observation, could offer only theories. Poisoning emerged as a possibility, though no clear evidence initially supported it. The household was meticulously examined. Servants were questioned about meals, beverages, and unusual occurrences. Neighbors were interviewed. Florence, poised and composed, appeared cooperative, yet her demeanor did not dispel suspicion entirely. Questions lingered. Could this have been accidental? A misstep in medicine or preparation? Or was someone within the household deliberately harming Charles? Charles's illness persisted for weeks. His body weakened, the pain intensified, and uncertainty mounted. Doctors experimented with treatments, attempting remedies for what they assumed might be digestive infection or another ailment. Yet symptoms persisted, a slow, agonizing decline that suggested chemical interference. Victorian understanding of toxicology was rudimentary, and the home itself became a site of anxious observation and quiet dread. Eventually, Charles Bravo succumbed to his condition, dying in apparent agony. The unusual progression of his illness and the suddenness of his death prompted a full inquest. Evidence was examined with meticulous care: his food, drinks, and medication. The possibility of deliberate poisoning became increasingly compelling. Chemical analysis indicated antimony, a substance often used in medicine, but in higher doses, lethal. Florence Bravo became a central figure in the investigation. Her behavior, prior conflicts, and position as wife placed her under scrutiny. Was she capable of such an act? Did marital tension escalate to lethal intent? Or had another party, perhaps a disgruntled servant, a family acquaintance, or a jealous outsider, administer the poison? Victorian society was fascinated by the prospect of domestic murder, particularly involving women, and the press quickly latched onto the story. Neighbors recalled arguments, moments of tension, and subtle signs of discord in the household. Servants reported incidents that, in retrospect, seemed ominous. Charles's complaints about meals, Florence's minor disputes over household matters, and the occasional mysterious visitor. Investigators constructed timelines, examining precisely who had access to Charles, the meals he consumed, and the medications administered. Yet despite exhaustive efforts, no conclusive perpetrator emerged. The inquest struggled with conflicting testimonies, limited forensic evidence, and societal expectations. Victorian England was fascinated by the notion of domestic violence and female culpability, but proving intent in an era before modern toxicology was nearly impossible. Suspicion could be asserted, but conviction required certainty that remained elusive. Several theories proliferated. One proposed that Florence, resentful and frustrated, had administered antimony deliberately. Another suggested that a family acquaintance, possibly motivated by greed or revenge, had tampered with medicine or meals. A third considered accidental poisoning, the improper preparation of antimony-based medication. Newspapers debated each possibility, and the public followed daily updates with fascination and horror. Charles Bravo's death became a national sensation. Victorian society was captivated by the idea that a home, a place meant for safety and comfort, could conceal lethal intent. The combination of social status, domestic conflict, and mysterious illness created a story that resonated across England. Authors, journalists, and chroniclers dissected every detail, emphasizing both the horror and the intrigue of the case. Florence Bravo's life was irrevocably altered, although never charged. She became associated with the mysterious death of her husband. Rumors circulated, reputations were scrutinized, and social circles whispered speculation. For Florence, survival came at a cost. A lifetime of public suspicion, constrained freedom, and the shadow of a death she may or may not have influenced. The Charles Bravo poisoning illustrates the precariousness of domestic life in Victorian England. Homes, meant as sanctuaries, could be sites of manipulation and murder. Limited medical knowledge, combined with social norms that masked conflict and deception, allowed potentially lethal situations to unfold unnoticed. The case emphasizes both the vulnerabilities inherent in private spaces and the enduring human fascination with hidden malevolence. Criminal historians continue to study the case for its insights into early forensic investigation. Analysis of antimony as a poison, its detection, and the patterns of domestic access are discussed in academic and criminological circles. The story serves as an example of the challenges inherent in investigating household deaths, where motive is personal, opportunity abundant, and evidence subtle. The broader impact of the case extends into social commentary. It highlights tensions in Victorian marriage, gender dynamics, and societal perceptions of domestic conflict. The combination of personal grievance, possible greed, and intimate access to the victim underscores how private relationships can become conduits for violence. Unlike sensational street crimes or public attacks, the Bravo case derives its horror from subtlety. The decline of Charles, day by day, symptom by symptom, reflects a slow, intimate danger. The home becomes a theater of suspense, with observers aware of potential danger, but powerless to intervene. Trust, routine, and care, all vital elements of domestic life, are weaponized. Modern examinations of the Bravo case emphasize ambiguity. Without definitive proof, historians and true crime scholars debate Florence's involvement, the role of servants or acquaintances, and the limitations of forensic science of the era. The case remains a touchstone in Victorian criminal history, illustrating how ordinary life could conceal extraordinary danger. Next story, Madeline Smith, the Glasgow poisoning. Glasgow, 1857. The city hummed with industrial life. The clang of shipyards along the Clyde, the hiss of steam engines, and the chatter of busy markets. Narrow streets wound past tenements, and the fog from factories mingled with the river's mist, creating a dense, almost tactile atmosphere. Amid this bustle, lives unfolded quietly, yet beneath the social veneer, ambition, secrecy, and danger often intertwined. Madeline Smith was 21, a woman of social standing and considerable charm. Born into a prosperous merchant family, she moved in Glasgow's genteel circles, attending balls, social gatherings, and private soirees. Polished, intelligent, and articulate, she navigated her world with grace, cultivating friendships and a growing sense of independence unusual for women of her era. Yet beneath her poised exterior, passions and desires stirred, including a relationship that would lead to scandal and suspicion. Her lover, Pierre-Emile Langelier, was a young Frenchman employed in Glasgow's commercial sector. Dashing, enigmatic, and assertive, he quickly captured Madeline's attention. Their affair, conducted in secrecy, flourished in letters, clandestine meetings, and whispered promises. But secrecy carried risk. In the strict social framework of Victorian Glasgow, impropriety could ruin reputations, families, and social prospects. Madeline's family, devoted to propriety, remained unaware of the depth of her relationship, while the couple's passion intensified in private. By mid-1857, the relationship began strain. Langelier reportedly demanded more commitment, while Madeline sought autonomy, constrained by family obligations and societal expectation. Letters from Langelier grew insistent. Madeline hesitated, balancing affection, fear, and ambition. It was during this period that events took a dark turn, introducing elements of mystery, poison, and ultimately, public scandal. In June of that year, Langelier fell gravely ill. Symptoms were rapid and severe: vomiting, fever, and abdominal distress. Neighbors and acquaintances noticed his sudden decline. Madeline, who had been seen sending him correspondence and visiting discreetly, became the focus of suspicion. The precise circumstances were initially opaque, shrouded by private interactions and the norms of Victorian discretion. Doctors were called, attempting to diagnose Langelier's condition. Poisoning emerged as a possibility, though understanding was limited. The use of arsenic, common in household products and medications, could produce symptoms mimicking natural illness. In Victorian Glasgow, oversight of such substances was minimal. Households often stored powders and compounds without regulation, creating an environment where deliberate or accidental administration could be difficult to detect. Langelier's death occurred quietly, yet its consequences were explosive. Local authorities, alerted by his sudden demise and Madeline's connection, initiated an inquest. Evidence was collected. Letters, personal items, and household substances were scrutinized. Suspicions centered on the young woman, her correspondence with the deceased, and her potential motive, preserving her social position and avoiding scandal. The ensuing trial captured national attention. Newspapers chronicled every detail: the letters, the interactions, and the subtle tensions in Madeline's life. Victorian society, fascinated by the interplay of propriety, passion, and potential murder, followed the case with intensity. Madeline's comportment in court, composed, articulate, yet vulnerable, added to the intrigue, portraying a young woman both constrained by circumstance and accused of extraordinary transgression. Prosecutors argued that Madeline had administered arsenic to Langelier, motivated by fear of social ruin and desire for independence. Letters between them, interpreted for nuance, suggested both intimacy and conflict. Witnesses recounted meetings, messages, and behaviors that painted a portrait of secretive tension, yet direct evidence of poisoning remained elusive. The court navigated a delicate balance between circumstantial evidence, social expectation, and scientific limitation. Madeline's defense emphasized ambiguity, lack of conclusive proof, and the possibility of accidental ingestion. She argued that arsenic may have been present in the environment, introduced inadvertently, or consumed through other means. The prosecution's reliance on letters, inferred motives, and timing demonstrated a circumstantial case, yet the absence of direct evidence complicated proceedings. Victorian jurists faced the challenge of adjudicating moral and legal responsibility under constraints of partial knowledge. Ultimately, the jury returned a verdict of not proven, a uniquely Scottish verdict signifying insufficient evidence to convict, yet not declaring innocence. Madeline Smith was acquitted of murder, though her social position was irreparably altered. Gossip, speculation, and public fascination followed her for years, underscoring the enduring tension between legal resolution and societal judgment. The case illustrates the interplay between social expectation, personal desire, and the potential for crime within domestic and intimate spaces. Madeline's position, young, educated, socially prominent, highlights how societal pressures can shape narratives, influence interpretation, and amplify the consequences of suspicion. Poison, secrecy, and circumstance converged to create a drama that captivated Glasgow and the broader Victorian public. The forensic and investigative aspects of the case also provide insight into mid-19th century methods. Chemical analysis for arsenic was in its infancy, reliant on early toxicology. Witness statements, letters, and behavioral observation became central to legal argument. The limitations of contemporary science shaped both prosecution and defense strategy, creating a narrative where uncertainty, interpretation, and societal perception were as decisive as physical evidence. Madeline Smith's story persists because it combines psychological complexity, societal context, and the chilling potential of intimate spaces. The ordinary routines of life, letters exchanged, meals prepared, meetings conducted, were overlaid with tension, desire, and the threat of lethal consequence. The domestic sphere, often assumed safe, became a stage for fear, suspicion, and intrigue. The public fascination also reflects cultural preoccupations. Victorian society was attuned to propriety, reputation, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. A young woman navigating passion and autonomy in a constrained environment became a symbol of both innocence and potential transgression. The unresolved ambiguity, guilt or coincidence, intent or misadventure, amplifies the story's enduring impact. Beyond the trial, Madeline's life continued with careful discretion. She relocated, cultivated privacy, and maintained appearances, navigating a society keen to judge, yet constrained by legal acquittal. The story endures as both a historical curiosity and a study in human behavior, illustrating how social norms, personal agency, and circumstantial evidence intersect in cases of potential domestic crime. Glasgow, then and now, carries the memory of the case subtly. Next story, Lindbergh baby kidnapping, the crime that shocked America. March 1st, 1932. The Lindbergh family home in Hopewell, New Jersey, was a sprawling, quiet estate, far removed from the clamor of nearby towns. Charles Lindbergh, the famed aviator, had achieved worldwide acclaim for crossing the Atlantic solo, and his young son, Charles Jr., was the pride of the household. The family lived with a veneer of ordinary domesticity, nurses tending to the child, household staff managing the property, and the rhythm of daily life structured around safety and routine. Yet on that March night, the ordinary routines were shattered. The baby's room was dark, the nursery quiet, yet something was wrong. A ladder had been propped against the second-story window. The crib, once secure, was now empty. A ransom note lay where the child had slept, handwritten, precise, and threatening. Charles Jr. had been taken. The discovery was immediate and horrifying. The household staff reacted with panic, while the Lindberghs were stricken with disbelief. Law enforcement arrived, quickly realizing the gravity of the situation. The note demanded $50,000, a staggering sum in 1932, with strict instructions for delivery. Whoever had orchestrated the abduction understood both strategy and risk, leveraging public fear and media attention. The case became a national obsession. Newspapers ran front-page stories, radio broadcasts relayed updates, and ordinary citizens followed the investigation with a mix of hope, horror, and fascination. The Lindbergh name lent gravity to the crime, turning a domestic abduction into a symbol of vulnerability and chaos in American life. Families everywhere feared that the innocence of childhood could be stolen in an instant. Detectives combed the estate, examining every detail: footprints in the snow outside the nursery, the placement of the ladder, traces of soil on windowsills. Each clue was scrutinized for insight into the kidnapper's identity, methods, and possible escape routes. Yet evidence was scarce, carefully chosen by a criminal who understood secrecy and misdirection. Negotiations followed. The Lindberghs, advised by law enforcement, communicated with the kidnappers according to instructions. Money was gathered, plans arranged for transfer, and every precaution was taken to ensure compliance while maximizing the child's chance of return. Yet the exchange never proceeded as expected. The perpetrator remained elusive, vanishing into the night without fulfilling their promises. As days turned into weeks, the country was gripped by uncertainty and dread. Investigators expanded their search, coordinating with neighboring towns, examining suspicious activity, and interrogating individuals connected to the family. Psychological profiles of the kidnapper emerged. Meticulous, patient, familiar with the estate, and aware of both opportunity and consequence. The crime was calculated, audacious, and deeply personal in its execution. Tragically, on May 12, 1932, the case took a devastating turn. The body of Charles Jr. was discovered in the woods near the Lindbergh estate, just a few miles from home. Death had occurred from a blow to the head, ending any hope of reunion. The nation recoiled in horror, the tragedy amplified by the child's fame and the innocence he represented. Mourning was immediate and universal, spanning communities far beyond New Jersey. Investigation intensified. Clues from the ransom notes, soil samples, handwriting analysis, and witness accounts were meticulously examined. Law enforcement identified leads, tracking movements, tracing financial transactions, and coordinating across state lines. Yet the case remained elusive, frustrating investigators and igniting public anxiety. The audacity of the crime, combined with its intimate targeting, created an atmosphere of vulnerability in households across the country. Months of investigation culminated in the arrest of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant with a complex personal history. Evidence connected him to the ransom money, and inconsistencies in his testimony raised suspicion. Forensic analysis, including handwriting comparison and tracing of marked bills, built a case that bridged circumstantial and physical evidence. The trial would become one of the most sensational of the 20th century. Hauptmann's trial was a media spectacle. The courtroom brimmed with journalists, photographers, and spectators. Daily proceedings were reported nationwide. Prosecutors detailed the sequence of abduction, ransom communication, and the discovery of the body, connecting Hauptmann to each element. Defense attorneys contested the evidence, emphasizing inconsistencies, possible misidentification, and gaps in the investigation. Yet the weight of cumulative evidence proved overwhelming. The public followed every detail, torn between hope for justice and the grief of a lost child. Psychological tension, courtroom drama, and the chilling simplicity of the crime captivated Americans. Parents, particularly, were drawn into the narrative. The abduction of an innocent child from a seemingly secure home challenged assumptions about domestic safety and societal order. In 1935, Hauptmann was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Appeals followed, drawing attention to the complexities of evidence, immigrant bias, and the fairness of the judicial process. Ultimately, the sentence was carried out, bringing a form of legal closure to the nation, though debate over his guilt persisted among scholars and true crime historians. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping had lasting impact beyond the immediate tragedy. It reshaped law enforcement methods, influencing the creation of more structured investigative protocols, including the Federal Kidnapping Act, the Lindbergh Law, which made transporting kidnapped victims across state lines a federal offense. Public awareness of child safety, home security, and the potential for crime in familiar spaces increased dramatically. The Lindbergh case endures in memory because of its combination of personal horror, societal impact, and investigative challenge. Charles Jr. represents innocence disrupted, ambition and fame confronted by ordinary vulnerability, and a family thrust into extraordinary grief. The audacity, planning, and intimate targeting of the abduction continue to captivate historians, criminologists, and the public alike. Walking past the Lindbergh estate today, the streets appear ordinary. Neighborhoods bustle with daily life. Yet for those who study history, the echo of March 1932 persists. It is a reminder of vulnerability, the fragility of domestic security, and the profound consequences of a crime executed with patience, knowledge, and precision. Next story, Florence Maybrick, the poison trial that captivated England. Liverpool, 1889. The city was a maze of narrow streets, dockyards, and warehouses, smelling of brine, coal smoke, and tar. Horse-drawn carts clattered along uneven cobblestones, and the cries of merchants and sailors filled the air. Amid the industrial bustle, Florence Maybrick moved quietly through her world, a woman whose presence drew both admiration and scrutiny. She was young, elegant, and increasingly restless within the confines of Victorian society. Florence had married James Maybrick, a wealthy cotton merchant, in 1881. The marriage promised security and status, but domestic life was fraught with tension. James, a man known for his charm, yet burdened with health complaints, was often irritable, and Florence found herself navigating moods, grievances, and social expectation. The household was elaborate but tense, rooms meticulously maintained, servants attentive, yet an undercurrent of unease persisted. By 1889, James Maybrick's health had deteriorated. He suffered from digestive issues, insomnia, and frequent fainting spells. Symptoms escalated suddenly. Nausea, severe stomach pain, and collapse became common. Neighbors noted the comings and goings of Florence, whose demeanor appeared increasingly guarded. Friends remarked on the quiet intensity of her interactions, particularly surrounding meals and medicine. James's condition worsened despite medical attention. Physicians of the era, limited in chemical analysis, struggled to identify the cause. Florence was often present during treatments, administering powders, tinctures, and elixirs according to prescription. But soon after, James grew sicker, prompting suspicion among doctors and acquaintances. The question emerged: was this the natural progression of illness, or was someone interfering? Traces of arsenic were discovered posthumously, though initial findings were inconsistent. Arsenic, commonly found in domestic remedies and tonics, could be both healing and lethal. Investigators noted the timing of symptoms relative to Florence's presence, as well as her knowledge of the household and medicines. Letters, receipts, and the smallest details were collected as evidence. Every interaction became a piece of a larger, unsettling puzzle. The Liverpool authorities launched a formal investigation. Florence was arrested, and her trial became a sensation across Britain. Newspapers ran serialized reports, emphasizing mystery, marital discord, and the challenge of proving intent in domestic deaths. Every day, the courtroom was filled with tension. Spectators leaned forward, waiting for testimony, chemical evidence, and the minutiae of daily life that now took on sinister significance. The prosecution argued that Florence had administered arsenic deliberately, motivated by dissatisfaction and potential financial gain. Witnesses described unusual behaviors: Florence checking doses, consulting with pharmacists, and appearing unusually calm during her husband's deteriorating health. The narrative painted a portrait of a woman whose actions, subtle yet precise, may have contributed directly to James Maybrick's decline. The defense countered with uncertainty. They highlighted the widespread presence of arsenic in Victorian households, the limitations of chemical analysis, and the possibility that James Maybrick ingested lethal doses accidentally. Testimony emphasized routine medication, domestic habits, and the difficulty of proving deliberate intent. The tension between circumstantial evidence and concrete proof became the focal point of the trial. As proceedings unfolded, attention shifted to the broader atmosphere of Victorian domestic life. Homes, medicine cabinets, and private spaces were revealed as potential sites of danger, places where subtle errors or deliberate acts could have devastating consequences. Observers debated, whispered, and speculated, yet the truth remained frustratingly elusive. Despite the ambiguity, Florence was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in 1889. Public outcry followed. Appeals, petitions, and widespread discussion highlighted the societal fascination with the case. Some argued she was innocent, a victim of circumstance and biased investigation. Others insisted on her guilt. In 1904, after years of imprisonment and public scrutiny, Florence's sentence was commuted and she was released. Her life after release remained quiet. She married again, lived outside the public eye, and retained her dignity despite enduring notoriety. Yet the story of James Maybrick's death and the trial of Florence persisted in public consciousness, a testament to the intrigue surrounding domestic poisoning, mystery, and legal drama. The case itself is striking for its procedural intricacies. The use of early forensic chemistry, witness testimony about daily habits, and the careful analysis of arsenic presence. Letters, household logs, and detailed medical records became central to the narrative. Every teaspoon of powder, every prescription, and every domestic action took on new meaning under scrutiny. Liverpool streets, both then and now, carry the echoes of the trial. The city's industrial backdrop, smoke, water, and cobbled alleys, frames a story where intimate life intersects with danger, where everyday actions might conceal lethal potential. Courtyards and doorways whisper of tension, observation, and the slow unraveling of a mystery that gripped a nation. Florence Maybrick's story remains compelling not only for its outcome, but for its narrative texture. It is a case of tension, uncertainty, and observation, a domestic thriller unfolding in real time, where every action could be innocuous or lethal. Victorian life, with its rituals, routines, and proprieties, provided a backdrop for drama that could erupt in the most ordinary settings. Next story: Murder at 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, Long Island, November 13th, 1974. The autumn wind whipped through the streets, rattling windows and carrying the scent of cold salt air from the nearby bay. On Ocean Avenue, a two-story colonial house stood with freshly painted shutters and a well-kept lawn. Inside, the DeFeo family slept, unaware that by morning, the household would be transformed into a scene of horror. Ronald DeFeo Jr., 23, had a tense morning routine, though few could have predicted the violence to come. The previous weeks had been marked by arguments, odd behavior, and increasing friction between him and his family. Friends described him as quiet, brooding, sometimes aggressive. Neighbors occasionally noticed him sitting alone, staring at the house, or wandering along the streets late at night. Shortly after midnight, Ronald awoke. He moved with purpose through the darkened hallways, careful not to wake his younger siblings. He retrieved a .35 caliber Marlin rifle from a hidden corner of the house. Every movement was precise, controlled. A faint creak of the floorboards could have betrayed him, but the house was silent. One by one, he confronted members of his family. Louise, his mother, was sleeping in her room. Two quick shots rang out. She fell without warning, and the silence returned. Next was his father, Ronald Sr., resting in the master bedroom. Another pair of shots echoed through the house. He collapsed, unarmed, unaware of the assault until it was too late. The younger siblings, Dawn, Allison, and Mark, were not spared. Each encountered the same methodical violence. The rifle was wielded with shocking precision. The bedroom doors, usually a barrier of safety, could not protect them. By the time the night ended, all 6 members of the DeFeo household were dead, their lives extinguished in the span of minutes. Neighbors, attuned to the quiet of Ocean Avenue, heard the shots and later called police. The early morning hours brought detectives to the scene. Officers noted the eerie stillness. A home once full of life, now silent except for the faint smell of gunpowder. Windows remained closed, beds untouched, and the ordinary routines of family life frozen in a moment of violence. Investigators quickly focused on Ronald DeFeo Jr. Evidence was immediate and compelling. He had been seen near the house the night of the murders. The rifle, found in his possession, matched the caliber of the bullets recovered. Fingerprints, powder residue, and eyewitness accounts aligned to place him as the sole perpetrator. When questioned, Ronald initially denied involvement. His calm demeanor, juxtaposed with the scene, unnerved officers. Over hours of interrogation, inconsistencies in his statements emerged. Eventually, he confessed, recounting the sequence of events in chilling detail. He claimed to have planned the murders in advance, noting each step with precision. The trial that followed was sensational. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators and media. Testimony included neighbors' accounts of Ronald's behavior, forensic analysis of the rifle, and details from the crime scene. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditation, the timing of shots, the selection of victims, and the concealment of weapons. Every element of the case highlighted the meticulous execution of the murders. Forensic teams reconstructed the night. Spent shell casings, bullet trajectories, and the positioning of bodies were carefully documented. Each bedroom, hallway, and doorway revealed clues. Investigators noted the sequence of shots, the angles, and the manner in which Ronald moved from room to room. The precision, coldness, and speed of the killings became central to understanding the case. Neighbors were called to testify about sounds and movements. Some had heard footsteps before the shots. Others noted the sudden silence afterward. A few recalled seeing Ronald awake in the hours leading up to the murders, acting unusually. Each observation, though minor alone, formed a mosaic of forewarning that no one fully recognized at the time. Throughout the trial, Ronald's demeanor remained consistent, detached, controlled, and eerily calm. Psychologists testified about his behavior, but the focus remained on factual evidence: the rifle, the sequence of events, the confessions, and the alignment of witness accounts. Every element contributed to the clear narrative of premeditated homicide. On November 21st, 1975, the jury reached its verdict. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of murder. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he would spend decades behind bars. The courtroom exhaled. The story of 112 Ocean Avenue became a grim touchstone for true crime in America. The house itself remained. For years afterward, neighbors avoided it, whispers of the killings circulating among locals. Rumors emerged of strange occurrences, cold drafts, unexplained noises, fleeting shadows. While media sensationalized these stories, the core of the horror remained the precise, deadly actions of a single night. A family killed in cold blood by one of its own. Investigators documented the scene in exhaustive detail: blood spatter, bullet holes, and the positioning of furniture. Every room told part of the story, and forensic photos captured the chilling reality. The rifle, carefully maintained, remained central as both weapon and evidence. Files, witness statements, and confessions preserved the sequence of events with precision. The DeFeo murders became a reference point for criminologists, law enforcement, and journalists. Every element, motive, method, and aftermath, was studied for its brutality and efficiency. Ronald's life following conviction remained confined, yet the story of that night retained its clarity. A domestic scene turned deadly, a sequence of calculated actions leaving no room for escape. In the years that followed, 112, Ocean Avenue passed into history, its walls silent witnesses to the violence that occurred there. Visitors and journalists documented the property, capturing photographs and collecting testimony from neighbors. The events of that night continued to haunt local memory, not for lessons or moral reflection, but for the shock of the crime itself, the precise, chilling elimination of an entire family in their home.